Donaldson and Dunfee think that integrative social contract theory gives us a real advantage in that it gives us ways of thinking about conflicts on the international scene, conflicts that involve multinational corporations and their activities in other countries. It is a helpful set of norms in many ways. It tells us how to go about, in general, resolving conflicts. It tells us to respect the ability of people to set up associations and to set up their own sets of norms governing things, and gives us some general guidelines about how that ought to go. We ought to respect human rights. We ought to respect the patterns and principles and general norms of the host country, as long as there are no significant externalities that are going to make it difficult for us to do that. And so there are a number of principles here that seem reasonable and helpful. But a number of objections have been raised against the theory. I want to talk in particular about an objection raised by Mark Douglas. Because he says, well, wait a minute. I get that there are supposed to be two basic levels here. The macro contract that allows us to set up micro contracts, and then the whole complex network, really, of micro contracts governing particular organizations, businesses, relationships, activities, and so on. But really, there's a third level that sneaks in, because we don't want to allow micro contracts of any kind at all. We want them to respect basic human rights, what Donaldson and Dunfee called hypernorms. What are these hypernorms? Where did they come from in the theory? What are they doing there? And how did they fit into the social contract framework? This is supposed to be a version of social contract theory. But at some point, notice, there's a reference here to these hypernorms, these norms that are not generated by rational choices among various alternatives. Where are they coming from? What's the story we can give? The claim is, look, they're universal. They're not relative. They are not dependent on a particular culture or a particular economic organization or anything like that. They are things that are fundamental, that are universal. But wait a minute, how does a social contract theory explain anything that has that kind of universal authority? After all, when you think about what's going on in social contract theory and political philosophy, in Thomas Hobbes or John Locke or Jean-Jacques Rousseau or John Rawls, you've got people setting up a set of principles under which they will live, and a political authority under which they will live. It is the contractors who are governed by the rules governing their association. How does something like a contract among given parties generate obligations for everybody, whether they're parties to the contract or not? That's what these hypernorms are supposed to be. And so it looks as if it's in principle impossible for any kind of social contract theory to actually ground and develop such hypernorms. Where do they come from here? And how do they fit into the general idea of a social contract theory? It's a good question, and I think there are a number of different ways we might approach answering it. One way is to say, maybe we can actually get them out of social contract theory itself. And there are two ways in which that might happen. So, for example, Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in different ways, try to generate the principles entirely through social contract. There are no real natural rights on their views. Well, there is sort of one in Hobbes, a right to liberty that's very vague and ill-formed. But in Rousseau, there aren't any at all. So maybe Rousseau is a better example. There are no natural rights. There are no natural principles. They are all generated from the social contract. So maybe we could take that kind of Rousseauian approach here and say, look, we've been talking not only about the creation of political authority, but after all, the generation of moral norms. Is it only the contractors? Well, we could say, look, it is possible for us in some way to generate these out of the social contract itself. Imagine not living with anybody respecting any moral norms. There would be chaos. It would be impossible to predict anybody else's behavior except strictly on the basis of their own self-interest. Things like trust, responsibility, promise-keeping, all of that would seem to go out the window. And so we could say, yeah, we choose to live under some degree of moral authority. So even morality can be given a social contract foundation. Now, there are a number of objections you might raise against that. You might think, wait, before I can enter into a contract, I've got to trust you to keep the terms of the contract. And so if that trust is lacking, but look, the trust seems to be something that has to be presupposed by the contract, or a general principle that we will follow these rules at least to the extent that we'll obey the contract and keep our promises under the contract. Isn't that presupposed? How can that be generated by the very contract itself? So that's a good question. A second question, though, is how can this strictly be universal? After all, maybe hypothetically we say, look, anybody would accept this, but would they? How do we know that? How do we really generate strictly universal principles that will apply to any culture in any setting, that will guarantee universal human rights? It looks like at best we can generate rules for our association, those who actually take part in the contract. Even if it's a hypothetical contract, you might say, I'm talking about what rational people would agree to. Well, what about somebody who doesn't subscribe to our conception of rationality? How do I include them? Do I include them? Maybe they're left out. But then morality isn't really fully universal? Anyway, it's a hard question to answer. Now there's a second strategy under this general heading. We might say, no, that's not why actually these are universal. They're universal because they reflect basic human desires and needs. And so everybody wants to live. Everybody wants to be free. Everybody wants to be able to have property and to be able to protect their own existence. And so those are just basic human values. Everybody wants to be treated with dignity. So the reason that people are not going to agree to a macro contract that is going to violate any of these basic human rights is that people care about those things. I care about life, liberty, and property. I care about being treated with dignity. And everybody does. Those are just universal desires. They're part of what it is to be human. And so it's not really that the agreement generates these things out of nothing. It generates them out of universal human wants and needs. So the universality is at the level of wants and needs. And that's how I can say, look, with confidence, hypothetically, yes, anyone would make this choice to live under the authority of moral principles. Why? Because everybody wants to live. Everybody wants to be free. Everybody wants to have the right to use their own property. Everybody wants to be treated with dignity. If that's true, then everybody's going to demand that those be respected by the contract. Now that's a little worrisome. We can raise objections against that too. After all, people do agree to become pirates. They agree to become gang members. They join the mafia. They do things voluntarily that involve, well, micro-contracts that do not respect these basic human values. And so we got to be careful. Say, look, every human being would insist on this. Well, in practice, some don't seem to. Are they being irrational? Maybe, but it's not so obvious what we want to say about that. And how confident we should be that these things are really universal. Universal enough to give us a universal authority to the moral rules we generate from a social contract approach. Douglas proposes a different kind of solution. He says, look, just get rid of them. We don't need the hypernorms. Just go with the priority rules. The priority rules we can talk about generating through the social contract because we realize we're going to face conflicts and we have to have ways of dealing with them. And just consider those and think about the priority rules and assume that they are going to end up generating respect for human rights. And he gives an argument for this. I shouldn't say just assume. He really does try to argue that this is the case. But it certainly isn't obvious that that's the case. Why is it going to turn out, for example, that we're always going to give priority to people's being treated with dignity? Why are we always going to give priority to respect for property or respect for liberty? In practice, again, a lot of societies don't seem to do that. So are we sure that that's the way it's going to go? Just from our ways of resolving conflicts, those things are going to turn out to be trumps to always win, or maybe not always win, but at least have a very high value in a way of resolving conflicts that doesn't assume them at the outset, but instead generates them from our ways of resolving conflicts. It's at least not obvious that that task can be done and that we can explain them in that way by generating them out of simply conflict resolution rules. Well, there's a final example, and that is to just give up on the social contract aspect of the theory. To say, look, in the end these hypernorms just have to be assumed from the outside. Now that does turn this into a different kind of moral theory. But we could say, as John Locke does, that there is a law of nature that governs the state of nature. For example, that no one shall harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. That Lockean natural law is something that isn't generated through a social contract. It is presupposed by the social contract. In fact, the social contract is something we enter into to preserve our rights to life, health, liberty, and property. Well, that isn't then something that has a social contract analysis. Locke is explaining how we get from morality of that kind, basic rights of human beings, that he thinks of as inherent to humans, whether there's a social contract or not, to living under political authority. Or maybe living under a macro contract or a series of micro contracts if we try to incorporate the Donaldson and Dunfee approach into that. But the basic hypernorms, the respect for basic human rights like life, liberty, and property, that's something presupposed by the whole thing, and that is not generated in a social contract fashion. If we do that, then we realize this is only partially a social contract theory. It's really got this more fundamental element, just as Locke's approach does to political philosophy. Once we take that step, however, we can say, well, actually, what's the point of the social contract aspect of this theory at all? Why can't we say something like that about the macro contract and about the various micro contracts? That is to say, why do they have to be contracts at all? Maybe there are certain things like the right to association, the right to liberty. In fact, I was describing some of these macro contract principles in exactly those terms. I was saying, look, in effect, this is a right to association. This is a right to association, but only with your own voluntary consent. And you've got the right to leave whenever you stop consenting, and so on. You might say, look, all that just is a matter of things that follow from those rights. And so if I've got a right to liberty, then I have a right to liberty of association. And that means not only forming these kinds of organizations with, well, on the basis of micro-contracts, maybe, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, but think about a friendship. Think about all sorts of other relationships where there isn't anything like an explicit or even an implicit contract between the parties. Nevertheless, a relationship evolves, a set of expectations develop, and people have a sense of what's supposed to happen in that kind of relationship. But it's not something that we can really, I think, usefully view as resulting from any kind of contract, no matter how micro. So one way of thinking about this is to say, look, really, there's something very valuable in this approach. Namely, a distinction between three sets of principles, three levels, you might say, of thinking about these kinds of moral problems. There is an extremely general level, the level of what they call the hypernorms, the level of basic human rights, like the right to life, liberty, and property. Then there is the level of other kinds of moral principles that seem to follow from those. Things like rights to association, right to enter into or leave associations with your consent, and to resolve conflicts in systematic agreed upon ways according to generally agreed upon procedures and principles. All of that, you might say, is something that should follow from basic rights to life, liberty, and property. And then, yes, so we've got the basic norms, you might say, at this general level. Then you've got things at what they call the macro level that are following from that and that give us more specific guidance about how those are to be implemented and what that means. And then we have the particular norms that govern particular organizations, practices, activities, relationships. Those kinds of things are allowed to be generated on the basis of those macro norms. But now, those micro norms are things that, while expected to obey the principles at the above two levels, have a certain amount of freedom. And what governs one kind of relationship in one kind of social setting may be quite different from the set of norms governing a different relationship in a different social setting. That's why business relationships often have rather unique norms that govern them. It's very different from a friendship. It's very different from a family relationship. It's different from other kinds of relationships. So finally, I want to say, there's a kind of compatibility between this approach and the approach we looked at when we thought about relationship models theory and relationship regulation theory. Those theories said Look, there are four basic kinds of human relationships. And there are certain universal norms that go along with those, but then a whole set of additional, if you will, micro norms that are unique to various kinds of cultures and practices, and that are within the general umbrella of that kind of relationship. We could say, that's actually kind of what's going on here, isn't it? There are certain things that really are universal that apply to, let's say, any human relationship at all. Then there are things that are universal in the sense that everybody views that as part of what it is to be in an authority ranking relationship, or an equality matching relationship, or a market pricing relationship, or a communal sharing relationship. And then there are ways in which that particular relationship gets expressed and has norms governing it within a certain culture or society at a certain time period, and then even within a particular relationship, a particular family. Families are different, after all. They don't operate by exactly the same sets of norms. Friendships are different. You might think, what are the norms that govern this particular friendship? What are the norms that govern that particular friendship? They're a bit different. And so you could think, yes, there are, if we think about that kind of theory, yes, there's a very general level. These apply to any human relationship at all. These apply to anything of that particular relational model, like authority ranking, for example. Then these are ones that apply to this particular kind within this particular context. All of those things are things that, in a sense, we already have the tools to deal with. But recognizing that there are three levels of norms, I think, is helpful. Not only in thinking about the problems of international business, though it's especially helpful there because of the ubiquity of conflicts, but also for human relationships and for ethical thinking in general.